So we can now begin with the art of simple multi-product auction design. And this is the art. This picture was on the wall of my bedroom as a teenager. And I will explain why later. I'm actually going to come back to this picture 4 or 5 times to illustrate my points. So if you are not interested in the economics, then maybe you can enjoy art history. But we'll begin with a little bit of economics. The work we're going to talk about today started with the Northern Rock bank run. So you may not know, but the British got the financial crisis first. The first public signs of the financial crisis that, really broke out a year later with Lehman Brothers was a bank run in the UK. And so we've got people queuing around the block here to get their money out of Northern Rock. And the Bank of England was very worried. This was a political crisis as well as an economic crisis. The first bank run we'd had for 140 years. So this was a huge issue. The Bank of England, the central bank, wanted to get money to banks like Northern Rock so they could pay the people who were panicking. And the problem is, traditionally, the Bank of England would only lend money to commercial banks that could give collateral in return. It would have to be US or UK sovereign debt or something that was pretty sound. But at the beginning of the financial crisis and during the financial crisis, banks didn't have high-quality collateral. They had these so-called toxic assets, mortgage-backed securities and such like. So the problem the Bank of England had was how to lend money to people with different qualities of collateral. Some had better collateral than others had. So it wanted to sell multiple types of loans where the type is the quality of collateral used by the borrower. So I got a phone call from the governor of the Bank of England. A year later, I got a phone call from the US Treasury saying, could I help? How should you sell these different types in a way that was going to be efficient and not too costly to the central bank, or in the US case, the Federal Reserve? And so the obvious thing is just running a separate auction for each variety. So why might you not want to run a separate auction for each kind of loan? Well, first of all, if you run a separate auction for each kind of loan, you won't have many bidders in each auction. And that's bad news because the bidders then will have market power, just as an ordinary market. Well, if there are few sellers in an ordinary market, they're going to do well against many buyers. If you have a few bidders against you in an auction, do well against you. So you don't want to let the bidders have market power. You would rather somehow combine the auctions. But it's actually not just a problem for you, it's also a problem for the bidders, because bidders have to decide which auction to enter. So at the end of this talk, you might want a piece of fruit for your coffee break, and maybe it's too early for lunch, I don't know, for whichever. And you might like apples best, but if banana's cheaper, then you take a banana. And so the problem is, if there's an auction for apples and an auction for bananas, which auction are you going to enter? You don't know which is a better deal for you. And in the same way, some of the bidders in an auction for loans from the central bank, they may have a choice as to whether to use good collateral or bad collateral. And they might prefer to say, we'll use our bad collateral, provided we don't have to pay too much higher an interest rate. So bidders won't like separate auctions, and indeed, nor will the auctioneer, because the auctioneer has a similar problem of how much to sell in each auction. The auctioneer would like to know something about demand before it decides how many apples to sell and how many bananas to sell. And so in the Bank of England's case, it had a preference function that looks something like this. It didn't really want to accept any poor collateral, but it would accept more poor collateral the higher the interest rate premium for the poor collateral was. It wasn't so concerned about getting money, it was more that the interest rate premium told it something about the stress in the market, how concerned people were, how desperate they were to be able to use their poor collateral and to reserve their high quality collateral. So we could just run a separate auction for each variety, but that doesn't seem ideal. So there are also a number of related problems that I should now mention. I've recently been talking to the Bank of Mexico about selling bonds of different durations. It's the same situation. Should they have a single auction for each kind of bond, or should they somehow combine these auctions? I've been also helping the Bank of England buying corporate debt as part of a quantitative easing, and they just announced that they're going to start reversing that, so now they're going to have the reverse problem of selling that. Talking about Mexico introduces another problem, which is that if you're my age, which most of you aren't, you'll remember the Latin American debt crisis of the early 1980s. So I think Mexico defaulted about 1982. They were going to pay off some of what they owed to creditors, and the question was how to do that. And so we had the so-called Brady deal and Brady bonds, and creditors were actually allowed to exchange their claims for any of a combination of different alternatives. For example, you could take a long-term bond with a high interest rate, or a shorter-term one with a lower interest rate, or you could actually take a bond where the payment depended upon the oil price. The oil price is important to Mexico's economy. And the way that was done then was that the relative prices of the different bonds was fixed in advance. And of course, that's not very efficient because one doesn't know in advance how many people are going to want what. And the government would have preferences about how much it would offer of each of these things. And you'd like to know what relative prices you can get for these things. So it wasn't bad, but it could have been better. Now, we're going to have another debt crisis soon, probably, in the emerging markets. And some people at the IMF actually think that the kind of auction that I have designed actually help resolve that problem. So I'll come back to that one later. Another problem is that Iceland approached me with a similar kind of problem. During the financial crisis, what they did was they blocked foreign bank accounts, and they then want to unblock them, not for the full amount of cash in those accounts, but for one or more of several assets that they would offer in return, which were, again, bonds in euros, bonds in Icelandic krona, etc. So these are various financial issues that can be dealt with by the kinds of auctions I will talk about. But it's not just financial products. A very important auction that I helped with was when Nuffield College JCR wanted to sell used exercise equipment. And so it had a small number of exercise machines, and they were sold by a mechanism that I will show you. Perhaps even slightly more important than Nuffield Student Union's problems is environmental issues. So when I was in Zambia, my last trip before COVID, I picked up some turtle dove feathers. And in Zambia, turtle dove feathers are easy to find because the local variety of turtle dove is everywhere. But in the UK, it is actually close to extinction. Its numbers have gone down by a factor of about 15 to 20 in roughly the last 15 to 20 years. So how do we conserve turtle doves? Well, we need to get farmers to conserve turtle dove habitats. Turtle doves need food to eat, water to drink, and scrub to breed in. And it's more complicated than just supplying food, water, and scrub, because these things have to be fairly close to each other. It's no good supplying your water 100 miles away from your food, because the little turtle dove chicks can't move that far. But there's also the issue that no one farmer may have all the kinds of specific habitats. When I say food, it's particular kinds of wildflowers. No one farmer may be able to have or to grow everything that's required. So you need to take in bids from different farmers and then put these bids together in some way. And so this auction that I designed and has actually been run a couple of times now, did it with Elizabeth Baldwin and Alex Taitelbaum, also of Oxford, has some features. This is mostly different from most of what I'm going to say, but has some features of the kind I'm going to describe. So that's a set of problems that have concerned me recently. And we've discussed why not run a separate auction for each variety. But another thing you might say is why not just collect all the bids on all the varieties and then afterward decide which bids to accept on each. And actually we did something a bit like that in the case of turtle doves, but that doesn't always work very well. It's hard to do rapidly, and with turtle doves we can make the farmers wait for a couple of weeks for the answers. But we're dealing with the financial markets, you really can't have a delay. It's especially hard to do rapidly if you're going to permit contingent bids, based on relative prices, which is the kind of thing I said that these bidders are going to want. They want to know what the prices of apples and oranges are going to turn out to be before deciding what auction to be in, for example, or what to bid on. It's less effective at mitigating market power, certainly if you don't permit bids contingent on relative prices, and it also risks creating perceptions of favoritism or corruption. So one country that I visited was doing something like this, and there were complaints in the newspapers that was the government, after looking at the bids, choosing lower prices on the varieties that their friends had bid on. So that's why we don't want to do it that way. But most of you will probably know that economists have auctioned many heterogeneous objects in a single auction on many previous occasions, and most famously based on the design that Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson, the recent Nobel Prize winners, have pushed a lot. And indeed, I ran an auction like that in the UK, which worked very well, raised plenty of money, makes me seen as a friend by the UK's Treasury. Did nothing very clever, except managed not to make any mistakes. Why don't we just do a simultaneous multiple round auction? Well, first, that takes a long time. The UK auction took 7 weeks, roughly. Sorry, I should probably explain what simultaneous multiple round auction is for those who haven't had Ola's course. So, roughly speaking, we simply sell all the objects in separate auctions, but they all take place at the same time, simultaneously. And people can bid on any object, and the prices go up on all the objects, but the crucial thing is that no auction ends until no one wants to bid again on any object. So we have round after round after round in which people are bidding, but you can keep on bidding until no one wants to bid again on anything. That's the rough idea. And so in the UK, we had 150 rounds until the bidding stopped finally on all the objects and the auction closed. That's one problem with this kind of auction. Another problem is that it can facilitate collusion or predation, because these 150 rounds, or however many rounds it is, people can effectively signal to each other by what they're doing and come to an agreement about how to split up the objects. And in some settings, that won't be a problem. My setting, it wasn't a problem, but another setting that's been a serious problem. And then a third issue about the simultaneous multiple round auction is it's very hard to allow the mix of varieties to depend upon the bids. In fact, you can't in a regular simultaneous multiple round auction. So in the UK auction, we said there were going to be 2 large licenses and 3 small licenses. We decided that at the beginning, and we were not going to change that. We couldn't change that. I mean, as the bidding went up, we might have said, gosh, no one is particularly valuing a large license relative to a small license. Let's break up the 2 large ones into 3 more small ones. We couldn't do that. Nor could we say the 3 small licenses don't seem of great interest to anyone. Let's combine them into a single, very large license. We were stuck. So actually, I think our information was good and we made the right choices, but we had to have good information to make those choices. And the Bank of England didn't feel it had the information to make the right choices about what mix of objects to sell. So that's why we don't want to do a simultaneous multiple round auction. So what's my solution to these problems? My solution is something I call a product mix auction, or more specifically, I have a family of product mix auctions because the specific auction I recommend will depend upon the context. So I have a series of papers on my website. The 2018 paper is the one to look at for most of what I will talk about today, and is a very easy read, not really very academic at all, which is important because I want non-academics to understand this. My more recent papers, I should say, are with Elizabeth Baldwin, who I put up in bold there because she is a fabulous co-author. But we've also written with computer scientists, Bickler, Fichtel, Goldberg and Locke, and other economists, Eden, Jagadisan and Teitelbaum. I've also got students involved who can actually go and play with my auctions on my website. All my software is open source. So what are these auctions? Well, there are 2 ways in which I'm going to explain what these auctions are. The first will be helpful to those who who start by thinking, why not a simultaneous multiple round auction? How does it differ from a simultaneous multiple round auction? And the answer is, this can be thought of as a way of compressing a simultaneous multiple round auction into a single round. So you're probably familiar with the fact that many standard dynamic multi-round auctions can be mimicked by single round auctions, by proxy auctions. So a standard English auction or a single unit ascending auction, under many conditions, will have the same outcome as a sealed bid second price auction. And if you've got a lot of homogeneous units, a multi-unit ascending auction where the price just goes up until demand equals supply, that will have the same outcome as a uniform price auction, in which everybody simply bids for what they want, and the price is the lowest price at which demand can be met. That outcome will be the same. And then if we go more complicated further to an auction with multiple units of many different varieties, which could be done with a simultaneous multiple round auction, then the static version of that is a simplified version of a product mix auction. In other words, if rather than running a simultaneous multiple round auction, I asked everyone at the beginning, what are your preferences? And then under natural conditions, I simply plug in the preferences to a computer which will bid the same way as people would bid in a simultaneous multiple round auction if they were bidding according to Nash equilibrium behavior. The computer will generate the outcome that a product mix auction would generate. So this can be seen as the proxy version of a simultaneous multiple round auction. Now, of course, in some ways it's less general than a simultaneous multiple round auction because people can't, do whatever weird and wonderful things they might want to do in the multiple rounds. One issue, which is actually a plus for my auction, is that they can't signal to each other and implicitly collude. But obviously there are settings in which the ability to bid in special ways might be seen as an important restriction of the product mix auction. So in that sense, this is a simplified version of simultaneous multiple round auction, but also in an important sense, it's a generalization, because the product mix auction will allow the auctioneer to express his or her preferences about how the quantities bought or sold depend upon the bidding. In other words, we would not be restricted to 2 large licenses and 3 small licenses. We're going to look at people's preferences and then decide what licenses to allocate. So that is one way of thinking about what the product mix auction will do. That's not the way I prefer to think about it. The more general way to think about it is that what I am doing is trying to find competitive equilibrium. I'm going to extract people's preferences and use them to find the competitive equilibrium. So a product mix auction has 2 key features. So I'll start with the second, since I just mentioned it. It will implement the competitive equilibrium allocation consistent with the stated preferences. I'm going to ask people what they want, and then I'm going to assume they tell me the truth. I'll ask the auctioneer what he or she wants, and I'll put it all together and find the competitive equilibrium. And the other feature of a product mix auction is the way in which bidders express their preferences can be understood, explained, and also analyzed geometrically. So, those are the distinguishing features. And the reason I like Dürer so much is because he was a great geometer. So Dürer was not just an artist. He wrote 4 books on geometry. This one here is one of 4 books on measurement. This is Instruction of Measurement with Compass and Ruler. So the second point is competitive equilibrium. And so, of course, this auction will work well if bidders express their true values. It's not going to work well if bidders don't. So we are going to assume that they do, and this will be a reasonable assumption if there are sufficiently many of them, and I'm going to talk more about why I think this is a good assumption, and why sufficiently many may not be very many. We don't actually need the auctioneer to state her actual preferences, because if bidders are bidding competitively, then they don't need to know what the auctioneer is going to do or what the auctioneer's preferences are. In fact, the Bank of England does say that it states its actual preferences, which is of course appropriate if it wants a true competitive equilibrium, which will then, under usual assumptions, maximize social welfare. The Icelandic government said, well, we want to use our monopoly power, so they can distort their preferences in order to profit maximize rather than welfare maximize. But what is important is that the bidders behave competitively. So, do they? Well, let's talk about a simpler structure, which is just a uniform price auction. I have got an auctioneer here who's selling 30 units, and they're all the same thing, so it's 30 apples, for example. And what I've shown is the bids of bidders. Bidders have different colors, so the blue bidder has bid for 4 at a price of 17, 8 at a price of 11, and another bid of 5 down here at a price of 7. And then I've got an orange bidder and a green bidder, and maybe that's a different kind of orange or red bidder at the bottom. And so what the auctioneer does is it just sells to the 30 highest bids, which is all the bids down to here, rationing the green bidder. And so the bids that are filled are the filled circles, the bids that are not filled are the empty circles, and the rationed bid is partly filled. And then it charges the same price to everyone. The price is the marginal price, which is 8. So this is just a screenshot from my software, by the way. So advertising my software at the same way, explaining this. And the point here is that any bidder who bids her actual valuations gets exactly what she would have chosen at the auction prices. So if the bidders had known that the price would be 8, the blue bids at the top would be filled, and the orange bid would be filled, and the green, well, if the price is 8, then the green bidder is indifferent about whether he's filled at 8 or not, and so he should be happy to be rationed. We will assume he's happy to be rationed here. And given that, then if you're not bidding for very much, then you do best to bid your actual valuations, or at least close to your actual valuations. I mean, who can gain here by deviating from their actual valuations? Well, maybe the green or orange bidder can gain a bit because, if they shaded their bids down, then they could move the price down from 8 to 7, say. Only they'll bid in integers, so 7 is the smallest change they can make. In both cases, they wouldn't buy as much as they would in the equilibrium, but they'll get a price of 7 rather than 8. So they might be able to gain a little by deviating. But anyone who is far away from the actual equilibrium price can't gain. Anyone who is tiny, just bidding for 1 or 2 units, is very unlikely to affect that price, is very unlikely to be marginal, and so won't be able to gain. And so not only can they not gain, but it's obvious that they can't gain or can't gain much. And so therefore, they typically will bid honestly, basically just express their true preferences, state their true values. Any potential gain they could make is small. They will see it as risky because they will run the risk of not winning at all when they could have won, and they will therefore tell the truth. It is confirmed in experiment theory and empirical work. I say it is not true if you've just got 2 bidders. If you run an experiment with 2 bidders, you will find that people don't bid their actual valuations. But as soon as you go beyond 2 bidders in experiments, even with 3 bidders, you will find in this kind of auction that basically people, quotes, tell the truth. And certainly if you go beyond 3 bidders.
Always assume that the number of bidders is known for everyone?
Okay, so in the experiments, they usually tell people how many bidders there are. So in fact, you might say about experiments that people don't take them very seriously. But on the other hand, in experiments, people actually do have far more information usually than in the real world, because they do know how many bidders there are. They do know, the distribution of valuations of other bidders, much more information than they feel they have in, quotes, the real world. This is a bit different from an ordinary economic seminar in which you start with a model and then you say, what's the solution? I've told you there's a variety of practical problems. I'm now going to tell you about a family of solutions, and we can talk about precisely what assumptions make those solutions optimal or not. And I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But roughly speaking, think of a private value setting. And we don't need to know how many bidders there are, except that people think there might be a reasonable number. So that's experiments. In theory, in Nash equilibrium, people do distort their demands a bit. And there's plenty of literature about that, but I will use the example with my very famous co-author, Meg Meyer, which is with linear demand, n-symmetric bidders, then people will slope the demand by about 1/n. So as soon as you get to 8 or 9 or 10 bidders, people are not deviating far from, quote, behaving truthfully. By the way, this is one of the few examples one can actually work out. So even these very simple uniform price auctions, in practice, it's very hard to actually work out the Nash equilibrium. And so that perhaps is a further argument why people will not stray too far when they can't gain much from simply behaving truthfully. And I've got a student, Charlotte Grace, who is doing empirical work, and at least on the Bank of England data she's working with, it seems that people are bidding truthfully. And the point that I want to make is, this is true even in ordinary uniform price auctions. I'm going to show you a setting which is much more complex, because people are bidding for apples and bananas and oranges and grapefruit all at the same time. And so it's even harder. Well, it is hard to see how you could possibly gain by deviating, because you don't know how to deviate, you don't know what's going on in these other kinds of objects which are being bid for at the same time. So, truth-telling then, competitive behavior is a good approximation for many, I actually think most of my purposes. And I think Dürer illustrates this point as well. In economics, we simplify the world, or we should simplify the world when we build our models in order to see things more clearly. We deliberately abstract. And I think simplifying these kinds of settings by using competitive equilibrium helps us see things more clearly and work with things more easily. And Dürer's geometry illustrates this point, because the geometry that Dürer used assumed parallel lines meet at a point at infinity. So parallel lines in Euclidean geometry never meet. For Dürer, they met at a point infinity. So this is actually a scan of a picture I drew when I was about 15. I love the fact that I can use material that I prepared 50 years ago for my talk today. And what you see is that all these lines that are parallel in the world, so these lines on the benches on the wall, the lines on the breaking up the windows, the rafters in the ceiling, they all converge in a single point at infinity, which he skillfully puts actually in a picture, because that's a trick of artists to put in a picture so that it does look at infinity for the viewer. Everything meets at infinity. And using that simplification simplifies geometry a lot. Because if parallel lines meet, then any two lines meet in a single point. And moreover, in any geometry, any 2 points define a single line. So there's a perfect duality between points and lines. 2 points define a line, 2 lines define a point where they meet. And that makes doing geometry much easier. I mean, Euclidean geometry is all messed up by the extra postulate to do with the parallel lines, special set of lines that don't meet. with a geometry where all lines meet, then you can go through a book, a textbook, written in the appropriate way, and cross out the word line and write point, cross out the word point and write line, and every statement remains a true statement. So, for example, these are two more pictures I drew when I was 15, because I love this stuff so much. And what these pictures show are two geometric theorems. One is about 3 points, these 3 are being on a single line. The other is about 3 lines which meet on a single point. So those are actually the same theorem. They're the same theorem. A proof of one is a proof of the other. And so it's not just a good approximation, it makes the analysis simpler or powerful. And if you don't want to learn from Dürer, then you should learn from physics. We're often said to suffer from physics envy. So I think in at least one respect, we should have a little bit more physics envy, because physicists understand that the theory you should be using depends on the context. If you are working on a problem about billiard balls, then you'll use Newtonian mechanics, and you understand that's an approximation, because of course quantum mechanics is the truth, but you'll use the right theory for your context. And I think in economics, the Nash equilibrium game theoretic revolution has gone too far. I think we should, in many contexts, be more willing to work with competitive equilibrium, because it's much simpler to work with, and it is, in many contexts, a good approximation. It is rare to have an experiment with more than 2 or 3 players where Nash equilibrium is what you get. Someone was telling me yesterday about they'd done an experiment on some of my own work of 20-odd years ago where I'd assumed Nash equilibrium, and they said, sorry, Paul, Nash equilibrium didn't come out from the experiment. And I said, yeah, well, actually, that's what I expect now. Because not always a good assumption. Okay, there are obviously reasons why we use it, but we should be a little bit more willing to do other things. Of course, behavioral economists have understood in a slightly different sense. So, given that we're assuming competitive behavior, bidding is efficient, it's welfare maximizing, it is informative, because people tell the truth. So, the central bank can look at bids and see what's going on in the market, see how stressed people are, and of course bidding is easy. If people understand that telling the truth is what's best for them, or sufficiently close to what's best for them, then it's easy for them to do, and this matters for getting participation. It especially matters for getting participation in a crisis where people haven't got time to think. You don't want to give seminars on how people can optimally bid. The caveat is, of course, that bidders need to be able to communicate their preferences sufficiently easily and sufficiently accurately. And so the whole game here, so I'm using the word game in an informal sense because we're not doing game theory, the whole trick here is to give people a way of expressing their preferences which doesn't do enough violence to what their actual preferences are, so they can approximate their actual preferences comfortably and easily. In other words, the language we give the bidders is going to matter. And so basically, we need geometric language that's easy for bidders to understand and use, for bidders to express their preferences accurately. It's easy for the auctioneer to understand and to trust. So the governor of the Bank of England came and sat in my office in Oxford. He had other things to do nearby, I think, but he came and sat in my office for half an hour, and I knew that basically I had to convince him within the half hour that this auction that I was proposing, where hundreds of billions of pounds are going to go through, he had to be absolutely confident it was going to work. And I was able to do that at a fairly complete, but not absolutely complete level. I took about an hour to talk to each of the deputy governors, which I did separately, and go through every mechanical step. So they were absolutely convinced it would work. And then, of course, bidders have to have incentive to give their true preferences, or near enough, have to be robust against other manipulation. So who in the audience knows who this picture is of? No? This is St. Jerome. St. Jerome, he wasn't a very saintly saint. He had a very bad temper and tended to throw things at people. But he was made a saint because he translated the Bible from Hebrew into Latin. And therefore, he is the patron saint of translators, the patron saint of people who think about language. Some say he's also the patron saint of scholars. So my point is that scholars should think more about language, should think more about presentation. I've written in the past about how you can describe an auction in two ways that are, from a game theorist point of view, absolutely equivalent. They're the same game, but because you describe them in different ways, they've had different outcomes. I mean, you can do that in a classroom experiment with Dutch auctions and first price auctions. That's easy, but it's also happened in auctions for billions of pounds. So presentation matters. I'm not the only person to say this, of course. Behavioral economists talk all the time about framing mattering. Today, what I'm just emphasizing is that language matters. So this is St. Jerome and his study with my 15-year-old handwriting by Albrecht Dürer. So the first iteration of the product mix auction I developed in 2007 to 8, and we started just with two types of goods, because with two types of goods I can draw pictures in two dimensions, and therefore I can easily explain it to people, and that was really important. And so the Bank of England started with just two types of goods. Obviously I'd rather started with more, but two is better than one. So we now do more goods and other more things, but we will begin with two types. And so this is a picture of the simplest kind of bid. This is somebody who would like an apple, who's prepared to pay up 60 cents for the apple. So in this case, if the price is more than 60, they want to buy nothing. If it's less than 60, they want to buy one apple. A more interesting bid is a bid that says, I'll pay up 60 for an apple. I don't like bananas as much, but for a banana, I'll pay up to 50. And so now that divides up the plane again into what I want to buy at what prices. At really high prices, I want to buy nothing. If prices are low on bananas but high on apples, I want to buy a banana. Converse case, I want to buy an apple. Not quite clear what's happening down here because you're actually willing to buy either prices that are below 50 and 60. But if we assume this bid means that you prefer an apple to a banana if the price difference is less than 10 cents, then it's just a 45-degree line that divides up the bottom quadrant. So that's what the Bank of England wanted to assume. That's what you assume if there are no income effects. We could do other things, but this is what we did. I have 3 children. Maybe they all prefer apples a long way to bananas. So this is the bid that reflects what they want. And so if I'm bidding for the family, ignoring my wife for the moment, then the 4 pieces of fruit are now bid for with these 2 bids. The way the plane is divided up in representing the preferences, I just superimpose the 2 bids. The blue lines are representing my children, the grey line myself. And what you see is that if apple prices are really high, then I buy bananas for everyone. Conversely, if banana prices are really high, but if prices are sort of in the middle range, then I will satisfy everyone with a mixture. If prices are really high, I want nothing, etc. The important thing is that we can just divide up the plane this way. And also, it doesn't matter to the auctioneer whether these 2 bids are both made by me or made by 2 separate bidders. And that makes things really easy to analyze this auction. So this is the bidding language. More precisely, a bid is a list of any length of price vectors that gives the coordinates representing the preferences between the goods and the quantity of goods that you want to buy. And so those 2 vectors represent these preferences. Obviously, bankers don't hand in pieces of paper showing pictures. They type in a list of bids like this. So this is an example of all the bids of all the bidders. And as I said, it doesn't matter from the auctioneer's point of view whether bids come from one bidder or many bidders. And the auctioneer could actually just look at these bids and choose the price pair he wants. He can just choose any price for bananas, any price for apples, and then looking at this picture, we will just give to each bidder what is best for that bidder. And now the only thing that's a little bit tricky here, because this is really quite simple, is how the auctioneer actually wants to do that. Because if I show that to the governor of the Bank of England, he kind of scratches his head and says, I don't know what prices to choose, I don't know which bids I want. Because I showed you how the auctioneer thought about things. The auctioneer had a picture which was a bit different. It had, I'll draw on this since I'm allowed to apparently, it had some preference function. You looked at the difference between prices and the amount of one of the goods. And so how do we, given our preference function, choose which bids to allocate? Well, it's not very hard to see, in fact, because for any price pair I choose, I can work out precisely what bids I would allocate. And so I could create a picture of what I call relative demand on the same axes as the governor of the Bank of England understands. This picture is simple because I've fixed the amount of fruit that's being allocated. I have assumed in this picture there'll be precisely 2,500 pieces of fruit, or 2,500 million of loans allocated, and therefore the quantity of bananas specifies the quantity of apples as well. And so in this example, I can draw this in just two dimensions, price difference and each of the two quantities being implicitly defined on the quantity axis. So you can see that it's not too hard to extract, and I can do this through a series of graphs, this picture which shows the bidders' preferences, the aggregate bidders' preferences. And so what I'm actually perhaps most proud of about this auction is just the fact that I can show in a set of graphs moving from the previous picture to this picture and then how you solve the whole auction. There are many wonderful papers on auction theory which suggests clever designs which are very hard for me to understand. If you read a typical econometric or jet paper, it's not infinitely transparent. It's a lot of work. That's useless if you want bidders to do something. If you want people to actually play the game and trust that it will work. So we have the demand curve from the bidders. We also have this relative supply curve from the Bank of England. So we're now using my screenshots, and we can then intersect them. This gives us the price difference and the quantity of bananas and the quantity of apples implicitly. And with this information, I can go back to the earlier graph and say exactly who gets what, which is not very hard. So what this auction does then, it automatically responds to stress in the market. So if we have, a regular auction might be the top panel, and then if we have the Brexit referendum, the bidders become much more stressed. They now want to be able to use their less good collateral, and so they bid more on their less good collateral. The relative demand curve goes up. The new equilibrium sells more of loans against less good collateral, but at a higher price difference. So this is exactly what happened the day after Brexit vote. Pictures aren't exactly right because the government's supply function is confidential, but the jump of about 5 basis points is actually exactly right. So this made the governor of the Bank of England very happy, changed from looking something like that to something more like that, and he really was very happy. I am told that at the bank's Christmas lunch that year, he made a speech to the assembled staff saying how wonderful it was that they could actually see competitive equilibrium being found on their computers. Because if you go into the Bank of England on a Tuesday at around 10 o'clock, actually every Tuesday now, but earlier it was just once a month, you will see on the Bank of England screens a picture which at the beginning at 10 o'clock is roughly just the blue line, and then between 10 and 10:30 as the bids come in, the orange line is formed, and then at 10:30 the auction is closed and the results are released within 10 minutes. So that's what happens, except actually that's not exactly what happens. That's what used to happen when they just worked with two goods, and so the pictures were two-dimensional. Now things are a little bit more complex. Okay, so we just have an advert now saying how wonderful it is. So advertising break for questions. So the acid test in a way was when the new governor came in and said, this is great, let's expand the role of the auctions, we'll have a new updated version, and that's when Elizabeth Baldwin started helping me with this project. And so importantly, in the new version, we did now move to more varieties. Important because it means we have much prettier pictures. And if you go onto my website, you will find pictures. These geometric objects, the kind of pictures you get, I mean, this is just a very simple example, a very, very simple example of a single bit. The geometric objects are so-called tropical hyperspaces, and we analyze them using tropical geometry. So that is one style of auction. And the bank's new auctions, they allow more sophisticated preferences from the auctioneer, but actually I'm very sad because they actually are not allowing the bidders to do as much. I find myself giving two kinds of talks. I talk to academics like you guys who will typically say, have you given bidders enough flexibility to express their preferences? Surely, things are a bit more subtle than this. They need to express things in a more sophisticated way. And then I talk, the other kind of talk is when I talk to what I call real people. In other words, central bankers or ordinary bankers. And what they say is, Paul, this is awfully complex. Do we really need all this? We're perfectly happy with a somewhat simpler structure. So at the moment, the current program that the bank is using is programmed to do all my bells and whistles, or most of them, but the bidders are not actually using the full facilities at the moment, which is sad. Okay, but the important thing is that we want different languages for different contexts. So let's talk about Iceland. We wanted to unblock these accounts, and so there's a very important feature of the problem. If you have what was a blocked bank account, you have a certain amount of money in it. And if you're going to swap that for bonds, your budget is the amount of money in your account. So you have an absolutely hard budget constraint that really matters. So I therefore propose a different style of product mix auction. And with enormous wit, I called it an Arctic product mix auction, as opposed to the tropical variety, which is what I've been showing you so far. And so let's compare them. In both cases, you bid up to your value for a good, but in the Bank of England's case, you prefer apples to bananas based on the difference between your value for an object and the price of it, your surplus per object. But if you've got a fixed budget to spend, you prefer the apples if the surplus per apple times the number of apples you can buy exceeds the corresponding thing for bananas, and making the appropriate cancellations, you'll see that means that comparing ratios of value to prices now. And if we draw a picture of the tropical language of the Bank of England, in which it was the price vector and the number of units, the Arctic case is the price vector and the amount you're prepared to spend in that bid. In the tropical case, we have tails, parallel lines at 45 degrees, but when we're looking at price ratios, these tails are now going to go through the origin. So the plane is divided up differently, and of course the solution mechanism is different. So that's the Arctic language, and in fact that's the language that the IMF might find helpful, because creditors' budgets will be proportional to their current claims. And so you'll bid your budget for a different alternative claims, which may be early or late repayment, repayment in dollars, your local currency, fixed repayment versus GDP. By the way, I hope I said that Zambia is not the country that's looking at this, even though Zambia is about to have a debt crisis. I talked to them about other things when I collected feathers from them. So that's Arctic and tropical. But let's talk more about the tropical. The design I gave the Bank of England allows me to make one-to-one trade-offs, which is natural because you want to borrow a given amount of money. So, I either want 100 million against good collateral, 100 million against bad collateral. It's less natural to ask for 100 million against good collateral versus 200 million against bad collateral. So can we express any one-to-one trade-offs? Well, sadly, we can't even do that. We can't express these preferences, which are actually perfectly natural preferences, because what they show is that when you buy an extra banana, it matters whether you've currently got an apple only or whether you've already got a banana. And that's what gives you this join here, and that stops me expressing these with the kinds of bids I've shown you. I can try, so let me try. Here is one bid that seems to cover some of my picture. Here's another bid. Here's a third bid. But these three bids give me a bit too much because they give me this bit that I don't really want, they give me this bit that I don't really want, and this bid that I don't really want. But note that the bits I don't want look again like a tropical bid. So what we can do is subtract a bid at that point. And if we subtract those three lines with a negative bid, I get exactly what I want. In other words, if I add negative bids to my armory, to the things that bidders can express, I end up with precisely the preferences I want. And I actually suggested this to the Bank of England back in 2008, and I showed them some pictures about why this would be a useful thing to allow bidders to do. And I think I probably shouldn't take time on them now, but what they basically allow is you to express something like, I'm absolutely desperate to get some money, so I want to get 1 billion at whatever the price, whatever the interest rates. But if the interest rates are really good, then I want to buy money of both kinds, but never more than some amount in total. So there are some natural cases when you'd want to use these negative bids, I thought, but as I told you, the real people thought that they wouldn't need these. They could do well enough with the other stuff, and so they were never implemented. Okay. However, if we were to implement them, we would then have what I call a basic tropical bid, which allows negative quantities as well. And why these are interesting is, if this is my precise language, using precisely this set of positive and negative bids, I can perfectly represent all strong substitutes preferences. And the theorists in the audience will know what those are. There are lots of papers about this class of preferences. And our language is the only language that precisely represents these preferences and nothing else. So this language is actually a way of characterizing these preferences. Paul Milgram, who's obviously a great genius and done much more good work than I will ever do, thought he had a language that does this, but actually there's a counterexample and it doesn't. This is the only language that I'm aware of that actually precisely represents and therefore characterizes these preferences. You might then say, maybe I want to substitute, not just 1 for 1, but 2 for 1 or 3 for 1, so we can generalize our language further. And what's nice about this is that, and there's the pictures now, the tails are different shapes again, representing different substitution possibilities. Now, any bidder with any substitutes preferences, any kind of substitutes, perfectly represents its preferences with this generalized tropical language. The generalized tropical language exactly expresses substitutes preferences and nothing else. So this is a new way of characterizing what substitutes preferences means. It means things that can be expressed with these pictures from this set of fundamental units, the positive and the negative bids. And the most recent update of the Bank of England's auction allows some complements preferences as well, but not very much. So the final thing to do, or almost final thing to do, is it's all very well having these languages, but how do we actually solve the auction? With two goods, I can do it quite easily graphically. And as I say, that was really important for getting people to be willing to use it. It's nice doing it graphically because you see the relationship to competitive equilibrium. You see your standard pictures of demand and supply, or fairly standard pictures. It's a little bit non-standard because in my representation, actually, there's two goods at the same time, and I can do that because I'm fixing the total supply. So the graphical solutions are nice, but once we go to more than at least three goods, I need to have a better way of doing it. And competitive equilibrium makes our life easy here, because we know the competitive equilibrium maximizes welfare. And so for the Bank of England's auction, we can set up a simple linear program. We think of the auctioneer as actually making available the full number of units that could possibly bid for of all the different objects, and then the Bank of England actually buying back the stuff to get the total quantity it actually wants to sell correct. So the Bank of England actually becomes like another bidder. We then put the Bank of England in with all the other bidders and then decide how to optimally allocate the objects to the bids. And that's a simple linear program which tells you what the quantities allocated to each bids are, and the shadow prices on the constraints are the prices that the auction needs to charge, needs to set. So a linear program does the job, and the Bank of England uses a linear program to do this. That works for the Bank of England because we only have positive bids. Once we have negative bids, things are harder, because now you have to figure out how many positive bids to allocate and how many negative bids to allocate, so that the difference, when you subtract the negative bids from the positive bids, you get the right amount allocated. So you need to look at the difference between two families of linear programs, the family with positive bids, another family with negative bids. And that was something that, from an economic point of view, I knew how to do, but from a computer science point of view, I had no idea how to do an algorithm for this. And so Bickler and Fichtel, the computer scientists, we got involved, and they helped us with that. And then we had another way of doing it, which is a non-linear programming approach, which is crawling through the picture, which is an approach which is actually more standard in auctions, although again we use our geometry to make that more efficient. The other computer scientists, Goldberg and Locke, and then there are methods for Iceland and for the IMF, which again use a different team of computer scientists, and are like Eisenberg, Gale algorithms for those who are familiar with the rather old-fashioned literature about solving competitive equilibrium. Because what I'm doing here is basically finding a competitive equilibrium always. So we finally come back to the art. Why do I really like Dürer? It's because the geometry that he and others introduced, that comes from thinking of parallel lines meeting, led to people thinking more generally about non-Euclidean geometries, some of which are used in the theory of relativity now and in physics a lot, but others which have other applications. And one which is really valuable for our application is this so-called tropical geometry. And we have a nice theorem which shows you can just study these geometric objects, because there's a one-to-one correspondence between the geometric object and quasi-linear utility functions. So you can work with geometric objects and know that you have a result about the underlying utility functions. And so this allows us to get new results about when competitive equilibrium exists. Of course, 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, we had Arrow, de Breuer, etc., doing a lot with continuous utility functions, but there's much less known when we have indivisible objects. And using this geometry allows us new results about when competitive equilibrium exists just in ordinary consumer theory. The reason we're interested in this is because to run these auctions, we need to know that competitive equilibrium exists. Well, I mean, if we don't have a competitive equilibrium existing, we have to think about what else we're going to look for, which is a problem I haven't yet addressed. So with Elizabeth's crucial help, we used this work to find out when competitive equilibrium does exist. I will give you a very brief taste. This is actually an example where there is no equilibrium when I've got just a single apple and a single banana for sale. So I've got two consumers. I've got one consumer who is a perfect complement consumer, who, if prices are low enough, wants an apple and a banana, but if prices are higher, wants nothing. We've got another consumer who wants an apple or a banana at sufficiently low prices, but has no interest in both things. Now, to find out total demand from these two consumers, I simply superimpose the two pictures, this one and this one, to get this picture. And what you see is that when prices are low, we can sell 2 apples and a banana, so 2 to the person who wants both and 1 to the person who wants 1. Or an apple and 2 bananas. When prices are higher, it's just this guy who will buy. But there's actually nowhere in this picture which will sell just 1 apple and 1 banana. You might wonder what happens here. If prices are exactly at that point, what is saleable? Well, the answer is that any of these 4 bundles is saleable, but you can't sell an apple and a banana. And there are 3 ways I can show you that. First way, which is because the picture is so simple, I can explain straightforwardly, is that you've got one guy who wants 2 or nothing and one guy who wants 1. And with 2 or nothing and 1, you clearly can't sell 2. You can either sell 1 or 3. So that's the easy way. But that's not going to help with any more complicated structure. So we've got two theorems that actually solve this problem in a more general way. First, we can actually just count up the number of intersections of these two pictures. There's exactly one intersection of these two pictures, and one, I know from my theorem, is too few if the pictures look like this. That's one theorem, and obviously I haven't told you how I know that one is too few. That would take me a lot longer than I have time for today. The other theorem is I can look at the slopes of the lines in these pictures, and there are two lines here whose slopes are given by the vectors 1, 1, that's this one, and 1, minus 1, this one, and the determinant of those two vectors is 2, and I can tell you, I can't explain now how I can know, but that number is too large for this structure, and that's a second theorem that tells me that there's non-existence. If I have slightly more complicated demands, so this guy is the same again, this guy has a more complicated demand, the rules for determining whether this is correct, finding equilibrium, are actually the same. And now we have two intersections between the blue guy and the black guy, and 2 is the right number. So equilibrium always exists, whatever bundle I'm trying to sell. Moreover, look at the slopes of all the lines and the slope of all these lines. Take any pair of vectors, one from one picture and one from the other picture, and your determinant will be 0 or plus or minus 1. So that also tells us that there will always be an equilibrium. And indeed, you can see that all possible bundles appear somewhere on this picture. Equilibrium always exists. So it's just consumer theory now, but it tells us whether equilibrium will exist, and therefore whether running an auction of my style, which is based around competitive equilibrium, at the moment at least, will work. So the last thing we've been doing recently is extending these consumer theory results to incorporate income effects. And having done that, go back and work harder on auctions where income effects matter. Of course, I've got this budget-constrained one already, but that's a very specific structure of income effects. So, to finish, product mix auctions will offer you lots of options. I've shown you a few. There are more. Different kinds of preferences. I said that the Bank of England's total supply, for example, now depends upon the bidding. Different pricing rules. I have focused upon uniform pricing rules in which anyone who wins a particular kind of object pays the same price for that kind of object. We can have different objective functions, welfare maximization, cost minimization, profit maximization. We can have multiple sellers as well as multiple buyers. We can even have traders. We can do lots more of this sort of stuff. So that's what I want you as being interested in auctions to remember. My more general conclusions are from my art. First of all, St. Jerome, think about language. Think about the appropriate language for communicating preferences. Competitive equilibrium is much easier to work with in many settings than Nash equilibrium. And I mean this in auction design more generally. Very little about solving even the most basic kind of single variety auctions once you've got more than one object to sell. Competitive equilibrium may be a much better way of thinking about things, and perhaps in other parts of economics as well. And geometry may help the analysis. So for further inspiration, you can find it here in Oxford. And if all you want is what I've done so far, then most of that is very easy to read paper. It's on my website. Thank you very much.